Since it's Feb Regency, I, of course, have to talk about my and probably just about everyone's favorite Regency book. And of course, that would be Pride and Prejudice. I'm not going to share any sort of big literary analysis of this book, as that has been done much better by people smarter and more well read than me. But I thought I'd share my own personal story with this book because I actually have one. Even though I've read, since the time I actually read Pride and Prejudice for the first time as a very young teenager, I've read thousands of books. That is not meant to be a brag. That's just saying I've read a lot of books. I'm a voracious reader, not all classics, but all over the map. Current books, older books, just a variety, whatever catches my interest at the time. But even though I've read many books between reading Pride and Prejudice for the first time and now, I actually still remember first reading the story. And so I thought I would share that. So I'm thinking I was about 12 or 13. And even at that point in my life, I was a voracious reader. As soon as I could actually start to read on my own, I went to the library every week and we would just get a variety of books. I would walk out with just stacks and stacks of them that I would just devour over the next week or two. And at that time, I was reading, actually, I had just come off a period of reading the Laura Ingalls Wilder books, all of her Little House in the Big Prairie books, and that entire set, starting from Little House in the Big Woods all the way through the first 4 years, which is about the first 4 years of her marriage to Almanzo. And I so loved that book series that I actually read it over and over and over. I was just so enraptured by being taken to a different time and a different place. And I think that's where I first grew to love reading books that came from a long time ago, because it does put you completely in a different world. I could be sitting there on the love seat in my parents' house looking out at the street there back in 1970s California. But in my mind, I was back in the 1870s with Laura and her family. And also around that time, I also enjoyed reading my dad's classic comics. Back when he was a kid, he got the classic comics both in the pre-war years, pre-World War II, and then also, I think it was maybe just after. First, it was called, I think, just Classic Comics. It was called Classics Illustrated. If you've ever seen the old pulp comics that have the yellow square in the upper left-hand corner, that's those. And he had a huge collection of them, which I've actually just recently found, and I hope to scan and perhaps share at the Internet Archive. But that's, I think, where I got my love for classics, was reading classic comics, because it distilled down the basics in a way that a 9 or 10-year-old could understand. But anyway, back to Pride and Prejudice. So I had just gotten past my time of the Laura Ingalls Wilder books, and I started reading some other, what I would call probably sister fiction. I myself grew up in a family of 5 daughters, and so something happened where it came to my awareness about Louisa May Alcott and Little Women, and me and my younger sister had read that together, and I feel sorry for my poor mom because I think we started calling her Marmee. At least that was only brief. It was only brief. But, because, kids are like that. And just showing my favorite cover for Pride and Prejudice while I'm discussing this. So I thought, well, that's interesting, but, that family only had 4 sisters. I've got 5 sisters. And so somehow I found out that Pride and Prejudice was about 5 sisters. I'm like, okay, I've got to read this, even if it's like way old. Because again, 12 or 13, I hadn't had much true experience with, shall we say, real classics. I had a lot of experience with the comics, but not much with the actual books themselves outside of class. I mean, we had definitely covered some classics, especially classic children's literature back that time prior to 6th grade. But I remember getting this book from the library, and again, sitting in that love seat by the window, looking out on my street. And I can still remember being absolutely blown away, and this is for real, by the first line of the book. I mean, probably one of the most famous first lines of books, except for Moby Dick, maybe. But I remember just reading that and just kind of just stopping, just like, huh? And then I just burst out laughing because that's a funny first line. And even though that language is a bit elevated and, not my typical, 12-year-old reading, it was funny. I could still just remember that going, wow, maybe, classic books or books from a long time ago aren't as sometimes big and scary as they seem when you're trying to, learn them appropriately and be able to discuss them appropriately, in elementary school. And so I dug into that with absolute delight. And it so reflected to me, even though it was, how old would that have been at that point? 175 years, past, that old, that the common humanity of sisters and the way it can just be, that just seemed so accurate. I mean, even if we didn't have those precise interactions, it's like, yeah, she knows sisters. And I remember specifically, too, being like, I thought the language was a bit strange in terms of the spelling. Remember the first time I saw how she spelled connection with an X instead of the CT, I had to actually read that. I was like, oh, that's connection. Or what's connexing? I'm just trying to read it in my head and didn't quite get that. And to use condole as a verb when I had only ever heard condolence. So she was upping my language game, even way back in the day. And I just remember so enjoying it and just being like, I need to read more books by her. Who was this person? I want to find out more about her. Because even back then, when I found something I loved, I got obsessed about it. And so I got obsessed about Pride and Prejudice. And I thought I would share with you today not only my own personal story of me, Elizabeth, and Darcy, but also share my favorite edition of it. And you can get it totally free anytime you want. I'm showing the cover right here. It's the gorgeous 1894 edition that was illustrated by Hugh Thompson. And if you've done much looking at various blogs or Jane Austen memorabilia, you'll often see this cover, say, put on a tote bag or different sort of things like that, because it's beautiful. It stands out. This guy actually has illustrated several books that you can download at Project Gutenberg. Just put in his name, Hugh Thompson, without the P, so just Thompson. And everyone I've seen, it's just really well done. And so imagine when this was done in 1894. This is about 80 years past the time that Pride and Prejudice was first published. I think it was back in, was it 1811, 1812? Though Jane Austen herself wrote the book, they believe, 1795 to 1797. So actually this edition came out almost 100 years after she wrote the book herself and about 80 years after it was published. And so it's kind of interesting from that perspective. It's a book that's in the public domain now, obviously. Jane Austen, and even this edition is in the public domain. But what's I find interesting, just, virtually thumbing through it, is not only are the illustrations beautiful, but there's a lot of them. And sometimes they're of specific scenes, of course, that are in the book, but also some imagined scene, like that didn't actually happen in the book, but was discussed as happening outside the book. For instance, there's a picture of supposedly Darcy learning from Aunt Catherine or Lady Catherine de Bourgh, about that terrible Elizabeth Bennet woman, the one that one of the end scenes, he tells Elizabeth that he had this discussion with his aunt, and it was kind of a different result for him than his aunt imagined it would be. That scene isn't actually shown in Pride and Prejudice, but he actually has an illustration of it in the book. And there's a few others like that. And there's also some ones that are more almost metaphorical. Like there's one where it's a reclining Lady Justice holding the scales, and she's trying, and in the scales is Darcy's letter that he gives her after that horribly botched, um, horribly botched proposal. And so Lady Justice is there holding that letter in the balance, trying to make a decision about it. I thought that was very artful and poetic. And another thing that you'll notice when you look at these illustrations is, I'm actually going to show you a few, is that you'll find them very reminiscent, particularly of the 1995 BBC miniseries with Colin Firth and Jennifer, I'm going to pronounce this wrong, Ailey, that gorgeous one that we all love. I have so many scenes, like as in the set itself, so many of the dresses, even the hats and the hairstyles. I'm like, they researched, at least in part, this book, and they definitely pulled up some of those images. Like I'll show you a few in a bit. Like I said, you can go and download this for free in EPUB version that has all of the illustrations, and you can also just look at it on the web if you don't want it for your e-reader. And I'm going to go ahead and show that to you now, along with a few of the examples. All right. So here it is at Project Gutenberg. I'll make sure to put this link down in my book description. So this is the actual web page for it. And I'll just kind of do a little scroll, and you see all these details. I mean, down to these little things. And this one is when she's reading Jane's letter. One of Jane's letters. She does it a couple different times when she's away from Jane. And you can see even sometimes like the chapters themselves have an illustration that may or may not be a part of the scene. And yeah, here's the list of illustrations. So this is like how many this book has. And even the list of illustrations has illustrations. I love that. And see, look how many there are. Isn't that fantastic? You could just spend time just looking at these illustrations themselves. A lot of them have drop caps. So fancy first ones. Let's see if I can find one of those before I show you some very specific ones. Let's see. Mr. and Mrs. Bennet. Yeah, here's one. Here's just a nice illustrated capital at the start. And when they're illustrated, they're all different. They're not the same ones, which is cool. Like that's a very fancy N. Looks like somebody there fishing with more of a question than a hook. So all just a little fun details to pick apart. And I know it's annoying to watch somebody scroll through things. And so I brought up a few pages I could show you the illustrations themselves. So this is Mr. and Mrs. Bennet. And I think that's a great way to show how they don't get along so well, do they? And then this one, he rode on a black horse. And this is when they're entering into the assembly room for the very first time that everybody in Meryton meets them. So this would be Mr. Darcy, Mr. Bingley, Mr. Bingley's two sisters, and then Mrs. Hurst's husband. So I think that'd be Darcy. That's Bingley. That has to be then Mr. Hurst. Yep. I love the detail, like the detail on the clothes. I feel like you do see definitely a lot of these clothes and even these hairstyles in the 1995 BBC miniseries. Oh, right. And this is the infamous "she is tolerable" scene as depicted in this book. What a look on his face, my goodness. But again, clearly this illustrator loves this book as much as the rest of us do. And he's given, even in these black and white drawings, he's given them personality, he's giving them mood, tone, emotion. The only thing I'm not wild about in this book is that Lizzie is depicted as blonde. Lizzie is just not blonde to me. She's definitely dark-haired. I don't know if it's ever explicitly stated in the book, but in my mind, she is, probably because of the two versions that I've seen of the adaptations. Right. And this is Mrs. Bennet and the two younger girls. And again, these outfits and these hats and these hairstyles, definitely inspired the miniseries for sure. And this is when they're at Netherfield, when Elizabeth is staying there taking care of Jane. And at one point, they're all out walking in the Netherfield gardens, and the Bingley sisters make it so Elizabeth can't walk with them. They had all been kind of walking loosely together, but then they get to a narrower point in the pathway. Again, I love all these details. Even though I'm well past the age of loving, quote, picture books, I still think excellent illustrations can really make a book, and this is what makes this my favorite version of Pride and Prejudice. And apparently it's like the favorite at Project Gutenberg too, because if you look at it, it's included in the section of Harvard Classics. It's a specific collection that you can look at, and there's lots of books in this collection. But like almost in a 2-to-1 ratio, it is the most downloaded book at Project Gutenberg. Like in this last 30 days, almost 6,000 copies of this book have been downloaded. That's just the last month. The other most closest has like less than 30,000 downloads, which is still awesome. But what a distinction between like the number 1 and the number 2 book. And this is the most downloaded book in that Harvard Classics collection. So I'll just show you a few more ones I thought were fun. And this is the officers coming to Meryton. And oh yeah, that has to be Sir William Lucas. It's fun stuff. I think this is already when they're getting to Hunsford in the book. It's not really done so much in the movies. It might have had a brief thing in the BBC miniseries of like when she's out walking, how they seem to run into each other. Of course, it's a little bit more nuanced than that, but this is one of those times like, oh, there you are. Kind of a moment. And this is the infamous Hunsford proposal. Love that. And there's the Jane's letters one that we saw at the beginning. Oh, and this is what I was telling you about how Lady Justice, or Elizabeth in this case, is weighing Darcy's letter on the scale. Hasn't quite put it there yet, but it's right close. And the arrival of all the gardeners and their kids. I just love the little children's dresses in this one. I mean, can you imagine a little girl wearing a hat like that? It's just loved it. Had to share that one. Oh, and this, of course, you can just tell by that look on his face. That would be Mr. Collins. And this is one of those ones that is of a scene that's discussed, but not actually in the book. This is Mr. Collins, telling Lady Catherine and her daughter about all that is happening with the Bennet sisters after Lydia's infamy. That's a great Mr. Collins. And I swear, didn't David Bamber have like that exact hairstyle in the 95 version? Fun stuff. Let's see. Got some of my pictures out of order. I went back and looked through it a couple times, like, what did I want to show you in this video? Okay. And this is the scene when Mr. Bennet gets back and the letter that he receives from Uncle Gardiner about what's going on with Lydia. And Elizabeth and Jane are wanting to know what's going on. And then Bingley and Darcy returning to Longbourn. the infamous Lady Catherine de Bourgh showing up at Longbourn. Again, the illustrator is able to capture her hauteur and her looking down her nose at everything. Love that. And there's another imagined scene where Lady Catherine de Bourgh is telling Darcy about her run-in with Elizabeth, so to speak. And then this ends the book as the happy couples go off. So I hope you enjoyed my own personal tour of my, how should I say it, my love and my experience of Pride and Prejudice. If you love Pride and Prejudice, or you have another book that absolutely catapulted you into reading classics or loving older books, write about it in the comments. I'd love to hear your story about it. What's your personal story with this book or some other book that changed your reading life? I'd love to know. All right, I plan to at least do a few more Feb Regency videos. I hope you'll check them out and check out the other videos as I get them. I kind of did a reboot of this channel. I had some other stuff going on with it, and I revamped the whole thing. So I used to have a bunch of videos. I took them down, so this is my reboot. So more videos to come. Thanks so much for watching, and if you love old books like I do, please click the subscribe button to find out when I post new videos or when I go live.